Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to our Conflict in Brazil, Evolving Criminal Actors, Political Linkages, and Increasing Global Relevance webinar. My name is Irene. I'm Senior Fellow for Latin American Conflict Security and Development at the IISS. I'm also the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey series, one of the annual flagship publication of the IISS, which provides an exhaustive strategic analysis of active conflict worldwide. And their outlook, which is probably the most important thing. Today's session, focused on Brazil, is part of the IISS Conflict Briefing bi-monthly webinar series. It's the second briefing we are doing on Latin America. The first one was a couple of months ago on Colombia, but we also have covered other conflicts in Mozambique, Syria, Central African Republic, and Lake Chad, among others. The conflict briefing series builds on our armed conflict survey series and provides our practitioner and expert audience with clear, structured, and comprehensive information about active conflict globally. Complementing our work, we do every year with a report, with insight from eminent experts as our guest today. You can also watch the recording of the previous episode in our website. Also, this webinar will be posted there once it goes live. So going back to the main topic of today's briefing, conflict in Brazil mixes organized crime and political violence. A complex and ever-evolving landscape of criminal actors increasingly challenge the state territorial control and monopoly of the use of force, often also providing basic services and governance in their area of control. As I said, it's an increasingly complex and evolving landscape of criminal actors, mixing prison-based criminal groups, but also militia groups, which links with state security services and political connection, which actually makes the conflict much more intractable and hard to address. While the most immediate drivers of conflict in Brazil is competition over lucrative illicit economies, notably drug trafficking, and also over trafficking routes and markets, high incarceration rates, widespread corruption, and deep socioeconomic inequalities provide a fertile ground for criminality to prosper. Over the last few decades, also what we have seen is that the conflict geography has expanded from Rio, Sao Paulo, and other urban areas to strategically placed states such as the Amazonas and Acre. At the same time, the criminal groups have become increasingly internationalized in their markets, networks, operation, and this is actually raising the relevance of the conflict of Brazil criminal violence for regional and global stability and security. The current post-COVID context of much deteriorating socioeconomic condition and much reduced also fiscal space will increasingly stretch the government effectiveness and also will increase the appeal, regrettably, of criminal groups and also their quasi-state role. The last piece of the puzzle, I guess, is the general election in Brazil in October, which may herald some important changes in security policies with a possible return to previously deployed wide-ranging pacification policies if former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva returns to power. To discuss these issues and the outlook for the conflict, we are joined today by a fantastic panel of experts and friends, which I will introduce in order of appearance, starting with Dr. Marco Salan Ferreira, who is an associate professor at the Federal University of Paraíba. He's also visiting professor at University NUR in Bolivia, and a member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, as well as the Urban Violence Research Network. Marco Salan is also editor of the Peace and Violence in Brazil. His research is focused on the impacts of organized crime and state violence on peace in Brazil and South America. He holds a PhD in political science from Universidade Estadual de Campinas. We are also joined by Dr. Ryan Berg, who is Senior Fellows in the American Program and head of the Future of Venezuela initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC. He's also an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America and a visiting research fellow at the University of Oxford here in the UK. His research focuses on US Latin American relations, authoritarian regimes, armed conflict, strategic competition, and trade and development issues. We are also fortunate enough to have Ryan one of our contributors to the Armed Conflict Survey series. He is working with us on the Brazil part, so I'm very happy to have him in this webinar and finally to exchange more interactively in this platform. We are joined by Carolina Sampó, who is visiting, Dr. Carolina Sampó, who is visiting scholar at the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center of the University of Maryland. She's also an associate researcher at the Argentinian National Scientific and Technical Research Council, CONICET. She is a consultant on security and organized crime for different multilateral organizations, especially she especially focuses on organized crime, violence, and gender in Latin America, especially Brazil and the Southern Cone. Carolina holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Buenos Aires and an MA in international studies from Torquato di Tella University. Last but not least, we are also joined by Dr. Paula Miraglia, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer and publisher of Nexo Jornal, a digital-only news outlet in Brazil. Previously, Paula was the Director General of the International Center for the Prevention of Crime and the Executive Director of the Brazilian Office of the United Nations Latin American Institute. Paula has also worked as a consultant for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and she holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Sao Paulo. Also, my colleague Juan Carlos Medina Bickel is going to join us for this event. Juan is a research analyst with us at the Conflict Security and Development Program and also Latin American Program. He worked on several research projects on socio-economic development in conflict-ridden environments and private sector engagement in his native Colombia. Before we start, some quick housekeeping rules. So we will start with a brief presentation by Juan on the current violence trends in Brazil to set the scene for our conversation. After that, we will have a round of introductory remarks by our friends, speakers, followed by discussion, which we would like to keep it as interactive and inclusive as possible. To that end, it would be fantastic if participants could actually add your question and comment on the Q&A box at the end of your screen. We will try and pick them up in the course of the panel and ask our participants and our speakers, and also in the Q&A section at the end of the introductory remarks. With that, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be a fantastic and insightful conversation with our great speakers. And as I said, it's a very interesting moment to do it because also of the upcoming elections in Brazil. So with that, let's get started, and I will ask Juan to introduce us to the violence trends in Brazil in the last few months. Juan, the floor is.
Thank you, Irene. Can we? Thank you. Yeah. So in this short presentation, I will briefly describe some of Brazil's most important trends of criminal violence over the past years. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is known also as ACLED. So let me start by reviewing the national trend of fatalities and events from battles, explosions, remote violence, and violence against civilians over the past 4 years in Brazil. As this graph shows, in 2019, fatalities and violent events peaked at almost 8,000 deaths and around 11,000 events, with then a downward trend in the following years. This trend is like the national trend in homicide rate over the past years, which I'm sure our panelists will touch upon shortly. Next slide, please. It is now interesting to see how this trend is reflected on the subnational level in Brazil and where conflict-related violence is most concentrated. So as these 4 graphs show, by the end of 2021, Rio de Janeiro persisted as the most violent state in Brazil, with no major changes between 2018 and 2021. It represented around 16% of the total conflict-related fatalities nationwide. Nonetheless, as we can see on the map as well, the Amazonas state was different. As the color shading indicates, the intensity of fatalities increased by around 4 percentage points in the total number of conflict-related fatalities, and it is today the second most violent state by conflict-related deaths in Brazil. Other states like Bahia remained at the top of the list. Next slide, please. So against this backdrop, let me now delve into Rio de Janeiro and Amazonas states. On one hand, given its weight, Rio de Janeiro reproduced the main national trend beginning in 2019 and then with a downward trend. And if we see there is a gap between events and fatalities, that means that on average, the Rio state had around 1 fatality for every 3 events. On the other hand, the Amazonas state, with the increase that we already explained, has an average of 1 death per event, which means that the intensity of the events is much higher than the national average and Rio. Next slide, please. And now that was until 2020, December 2021, but what's happening this year and what's the situation in 2022 so far? So as this graph shows, in every single month of 2020, the first half of 2022, the number of fatalities in Brazil was higher than the same month in 2021. Now, if we go further and compare these figures to those of 2021, the number of fatalities in the first half of 2022 already makes 60% of the total deaths of the previous year as a whole. And the last slide, please. This last slide to conclude shows the 2 states we unpacked before, Rio de Janeiro and Amazonas, for 2022 as well. So far, Rio continues almost with no marginal change, with around 50% of fatalities, and Amazonas continues with this upward trend. If we look at these states today, they represent about 1/4 of all conflict-related deaths in the country today. So this is my presentation, and I'm sure our guests will help us understand these trends and many others. And now I hand it over to Marcos, who will set the scene for the conversation, explaining the conflict and some important drivers.
Thanks, Juan. Yes, as Juan said, I guess we like to start with you, Marcos Alan. I guess it is a very complex conflict. Again, I just wanted to say a little clarification on conflict. We call it conflict because for us, as long as we have some criteria of duration and intensity and organization of the part, we call it a conflict. But it is true that in the case of Brazil, it's really criminal violence, but also political criminal violence, but also political violence in some cases. And the conflict has evolved, has been going on for many years. I guess, Marcos Alan, if you could just help us really giving a bit of a brief overview, historical overview even on where the conflict started, how did it start, its nature and pattern of violence, and also what are the most pressing security challenges?
Well, thank you. I'm grateful to be here today with you all and discussing armed conflict in my country. No? And as Irene mentioned, I will share with you in these minutes that I have about a brief historical description about armed conflict in Brazil. And I think that's important to begin that Brazil in general has an image of peaceful country due to its lower participation in international conflicts. But actually, when we analyze the domestic setting in Brazil, we will see in our history a background of numerous conflicts and intense violence historically, both in the colonial period in which Brazil was colonized by Portugal, but also after the independence in 1922. So we have several episodes of conflict, like the cabanagem or the conflict between the slavers, also the indigenous communities against the state. But in the background of these numerous conflicts in Brazil, as mentioned in the Armed Conflict Survey series, it's also the inequality, discriminations, and also recognition of minorities. You see this very clear when we talk about the conflicts in historically in Brazil. But also, I think an important variable that we needed to take into account when we talk about armed conflict in Brazil is the state violence against this all population. We have several episodes historically in Brazil. In the proclamation of Republic, for example, was a military coup, or even the Estado Novo, that was a dictatorship in the decade of 1930, and more recently, the civil military dictatorship from the 1964 to 1985, we see several episodes in which the own state is the trigger of the violence that we see in the country, as also mentioned in the report. And what we see today is the police violence as an important variable to consider when we talk about armed conflict in Brazil. And there are several studies showing the need of police reform in Brazil, as we see in other countries that experienced military dictatorship, as we see in Latin America. But talking specifically about the nature of the armed conflict in Brazil, I think it's important to remind that we have two landscapes that Brazil has important armed conflicts. One is in the rural areas, mostly connected to control of landed territories. Historically, Brazil has this kind of conflict between the peasants demanding land reform, but also the landowners. Historically, this is very present in Brazil. And the main one, and I think it's important to highlight this one because the complexity of this kind of, in the nature of this conflict is the urban conflicts that are mostly connected to the development of illicit markets. Mainly the drug trafficking, since in the 1980s, the decade of 1980, in which we see the emergence of important criminal organizations like Comando Vermelho in Rio de Janeiro, but later in the 90s, and other criminal organizations like Primeiro Comando da Capital and others. But it's important when we talk about the nature of this conflict that this urban conflict is becoming more and more complex. It's not only an issue of drug trafficking, but now it's involving also extortion, big robberies, and even also the cybercrime by some of these criminal organizations, and using, for example, a tool to transfer money in Brazil, that's the PIX. No? And so, while in the rural conflicts we see in this landscape, the main actors, the conflict between the landowners and the peasants and also indigenous peoples, in urban conflict in Brazil, we see Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, or First Capital Command, Red Command, Comando Vermelho, Northern Family, Família do Norte, as the main actors, but also several smaller organizations and also the militias that are important actor when we talk about the nature of these conflicts. When we, specifically the patterns of this violence, they are different when we see the conflicts in rural areas and also in urban areas. In the rural conflicts in Brazil, what is seen is historically is a pattern of targeted killing of activists, for example, especially indigenous activists and also peasants that are connected to the demanding land reform, similar to what we see in Colombia. Historically, we see this in Brazil rural areas, no? But also, and this is one of the pressing security issues, no, is the convergence between the criminal organizations and the demand for land, especially in the indigenous areas. We see this now in which the criminal organizations take advantage of the rural areas to connect with illegal miners, illegal fishing, especially in Amazon, And more we see the interconnection between the rural conflicts historically that we see in Brazil, the rural tensions, because the inequality and other, and also the recognition of minorities, and also the criminal organizations that work in urban areas taking advantage of these conflicts. And specifically in urban areas, a pattern of violence that we see is the conflicts to control territories, but also to sell and distribute drugs in particular, and even also perform other illegal activities, like, for example, the cargo theft, that in Rio de Janeiro is important source of revenues to these criminal organizations also. Just as I said, my remarks is especially introducing this historical overview of Brazil. And to conclude, I think it's important to mention some pressing security issues when we talk about armed conflict in Brazil. The first and maybe one of the most important for me is the criminal convergence that we see in rural areas between traditional criminal organizations that work in urban areas that are taking advantage of of other illegal activities, and are connecting sometimes smaller gangs or smaller individuals that work, for example, in illegal fishing, and these criminal organizations take advantage and giving protection and also receiving protection of this kind of actors, especially in Amazonia. And because that we see the numbers of Juan Pablo has mentioned that and significant increase of violence in this region in particular. But also, talking about these pressing security issues, I think there are other two points that's important to this debate. The first one is the facilitation of access to arms during Bolsonaro's administration. This makes the condition of Brazil even more worrying for the next years, in my perception. No? The number of arms that are in the hands of the population make more difficult to control this kind of violence that were mentioned here, both in urban and rural areas. But also, it's important to address the culture of violence in the Brazilian police, especially in states like Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais, in which we see a high number of the people that's killed by police, and in general with a very clear and kind of race or even where these people live. And I think this affects directly the trust of population in the law enforcement agencies, because this is important also. In several urban areas in which the crime control some territories, or we see a hybrid governance between the state and the criminal actors, the trust of population is not necessarily in the police because this culture of violence, but in the criminal organizations. So this is my initial remarks, and thank you. And I am looking forward to hear the colleagues.
Thanks, Marcos Alan. It's really fascinating. I mean, I particularly find it interesting what you were mentioning about the conflicts between the rural world and the urban world, right? So it's really an interesting and very worrisome trend. And as well, what you mentioned about the trust in the police, right, which is something that we have seen being a bit undermined, especially in recent years. So I'm sure there'll be lots of to talk about in the Q&A. But if I can now move to Ryan. So we have looked with Marcos Alan a little bit at the history of the conflict and the reasoning and the rationale. Shall we actually have a look at what is happening now? Could you elaborate a little bit on what is the current landscape of criminal actors in the conflict in Brazil? And really, what have been the most recent conflict security trends, development, and evolution in the illicit business?
Thank you very much, Irene, Juan Pablo, and also to the IISS for putting on this event. As you mentioned, Irene, I'll cover two things in my remarks. First, the changing landscape of criminal groups, and then secondly, the evolution of illicit businesses. The first trend that I think we've seen, at least since 2018 or 2019, is the internationalization of Brazilian criminal groups. And what I mean by that is not just the intensification of competition within Brazil, but the idea that there are plenty of opportunities to be sought outside of Brazil as a way of expanding criminal groups, criminal organizations. The natural jumping off point for many criminal organizations in Brazil, be it the Comando Vermelho or the Primeiro Comando da Capital, was Bolivia and Paraguay, two sort of obvious places that both groups sought to have a presence and control over right away. But I think what we've seen in more recent years is even further internationalization. And what I mean by that is a nascent presence in countries like Colombia, in Ecuador, even to a certain extent in Argentina, given what I've heard from officials there, given a recent visit to Buenos Aires. And even further afield, I would mention that in previous years, we've seen major officials from the Primeiro Comando da Capital arrested, for example, in Lusophone, Africa. That there was a top lieutenant of the leader of the Primeiro Comando da Capital arrested in Mozambique a few years ago, and so clearly showing that there's a connection between Brazilian criminal organizations and Lusophone countries in Africa as the drug routes increasingly go across the Atlantic in that direction and then go up to Europe through Africa. So the internationalization of Brazilian organized crime, I think, is a pretty solidified trend that we've seen at least since 2018 or 2019, and I expect that that's going to become more and more competitive as groups realize that routes and different illicit activities are already sort of consolidated within Brazil. There's much more money to be made and power to be had outside of Brazil as well, and so they will continue to look outside for some of those opportunities. Now, within the country, and this is something that Juan Pablo displayed, I think, very well with his data presentation from the Auckland numbers, is that Manaus is the state in Amazonas, and in particular the city of Manaus are the areas within Brazil that are experiencing some of the most competition, and in particular the area around a particular riverine network from deep into the Amazon out to the mouth of the Atlantic, and that is the Solimões River, which basically has an uninterrupted passage from the tri-border area of Brazil, Colombia, and Peru out to the mouth of the Atlantic. If you're a criminal organization, it makes a lot of sense to try to control this area and use it as a complex riverine network to traffic your illicit goods. And it's not just drug trafficking. It's illegal wildlife trafficking, illicit gold mining, illegal fishing. It's a whole number of illicit activities that can take place in this region, but it is very difficult for Brazilian security to have any sort of presence in these very remote stretches of Amazonas state. And we've seen an uptick in violence in Amazonas state and in Manaus in particular, I think because of competition for this crucial riverine network. Now, when it comes to drug trafficking specifically, the network is important as well because of its position at the tri-border area. Colombia and Peru remain the two countries that produce the most amount of coca in the world. And so it does remain important for traditional drug trafficking, cocaine trafficking specifically, as the network of choice to be able to get a product from deep into the Amazon to the mouth of the Atlantic, from which it is, of course, moved either to the United States or, I think more commonly, to Europe. And then the third thing that I would highlight is the competition over particular pieces of infrastructure or competition for drug trafficking routes and weapons trafficking routes. And the pieces of infrastructure that I would highlight are ports. I think one thing that we found and we highlighted in the contribution this year, the Armed Conflict Survey, was an increasing competition for ports and port infrastructure in Brazil, given that this is some of the most important infrastructure for the export of drugs, particularly in containers. What we've seen in the past is, of course, Santos, the port in Sao Paulo state, playing a really important role for criminal organizations such as the Primeiro Comando da Capital to be able to get its product to places like Europe. Now, I think with the increasing internationalization of a lot of criminal organizations, they're looking at Buenos Aires, they're looking at Montevideo, they're looking at other places where they could have alternative port access without as much competition as exists in Brazil. And that in itself is, I think, driving some of the internationalization. I think we've also seen a competition for drug trafficking and weapons trafficking routes, which I think in most cases are some of the same routes, sort of up through Paraguay into Paraná state and up into Sao Paulo state and Rio de Janeiro state. We've seen increasing competition for some of those routes as groups are consolidating within Brazil. And one thing that I think was quite interesting that we found in this year's contribution to the survey was a change in weapons trafficking, not necessarily in the routes, but in the form in which it took place as an effort to evade import-export control, which is to say groups that were usually getting upper halves of AR-15s and other high-powered weapons from the United States or other providers, legitimate weapons, and pairing them in some cases with lower halves that were made from airsoft guns that were manufactured in Taiwan or in China. And the guns are modified and apparently fully functional. It's unclear to me whether this actually lessens the lifespan of the weapon, but nevertheless, a very highly creative way we discovered that groups are sort of 2 or 3 steps ahead of law enforcement agencies in using some of the routes that we know as being a weapons trafficking. Quickly, I'll move to the evolution of criminal enterprises. As Marcos alluded to, it's not just traditional drug trafficking that we've seen Brazilian criminal groups engaging in. It's a whole number of illicit activities that in many ways have greater upside or profit-making potential. It's cyber, as Marcos said. It's illegal fishing, especially in the Amazonas area, these remote stretches that are really difficult to patrol. It's illegal logging in some of the same areas, illegal mining, and increasingly, I think we're seeing illegal wildlife trafficking. That's something that I think we can keep an eye on for the future as a place where criminal organizations are moving into. But generally, Irene and Juan Pablo, I would say that the overall takeaways are increasing competition, internationalization of groups, and an increasing number of illicit activities taking place as ways criminal groups have found to make money.
Thanks, Ryan. That was actually a great kind of overview of the very complex and very interesting trends we have been observing in the last 2 years. And I think what you mentioned is really a picture of not only diversification in other activities, but also transnationalization of those groups in terms of links and networks and markets. In that sense, Carolina, I know you have been you're an expert on particularly on the Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC, and the PCC has been one of the organizations at the forefront, I would say, of this internationalization effort. Can you share with us some of your research on the internationalization trends of the PCC, but also in general more with regard to the position of Brazil in the big market or cocaine kind of drug routes and trade?
Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you so much to the IISS for the invitation. Thank you so much, Juan Pablo, Marcos, Ryan, for the introduction. It made my job much easier. I will share some slides with you because I want to show you some images. Just give me a second. So we will show the audience some of the places where we have been speaking about. The first things I want to point out is that democratization of cocaine, as we have been talking about, has been happening in our region since 2014. As you can see in the last report of UNODC, even though with the cultivation area is not so big, the productivity has grown a lot. So we have the region, South America is flawed in cocaine, and criminal organizations need to take that cocaine out of the region to the consumer markets. These consumer markets are particularly located in North America, Europe, and we have to think in the emergence of new markets such as Asia, or some places in the Middle East, and some places in Oceania. And as you can see in the following map, Brazil, such as Mexico, has a big part in this transshipment, and this has to be with the geography and with the not only the fact that, as Dr. Ryan has pointed out, the Ruta do Rio Solimões, which came from the tree-border area between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, but also of the southern route, the Ruta do Caipira, that it's about the Santos port, as was mentioned before too. But there are plenty of ways to take the cocaine out, considering the coast, the big coast that Brazil has. And as you can see, there is some points also marked in the African map. So we will talk a little bit about it more in the front. I will show you just like you know, like a glimpse where the PCC it is supposed to be located with much power or less power. And as we have mentioned during this discussion, Amazonia and Rio de Janeiro during the last 2 years have shown the biggest rates of homicides. And if you check on this map, which is from Camila Nunes Diaz and Bruno Paes Manso from 2018, I think, you can check that Amazonia and Rio de Janeiro are one of the states where the PCC has not so much power, and is one of the states where they are very interested in being there. I may think that Rio de Janeiro has a different dynamic, probably regarding the militias Marcos has mentioned. But if we talk about Amazonia, it seems to me that all the violence is related to the illicit market, to the need of expansion from the PCC. And this expansion is related to the idea that we were talking in the previous slide of taking advantage of these floods of cocaine in a region and the possibility of exporting to different markets. And we will see it just in a few seconds. But it is also important to highlight that there has been this expansion that Dr. Ryan mentioned to the neighborhood countries. But before I talk to you about that, I wanted to show you this pattern of violence, which I don't know how we will follow. You show some numbers about these two states, but we will see at national level what had happened. It caught my attention that during the conflict, the open conflict between the PCC and the need of PCC to expand to all over Brazil and not also to the southern part, this number has, go up into the skies. Brazil almost got 32 homicides every 1,000 inhabitants, which is very, very big. But after a while, these numbers came down again. It's not that they are very low, because 22 every 1,000 inhabitants it's a big number. It's important. The worldwide media is around 5, 6 every 100,000 inhabitants, but it shows a trend that may show us what is happening into the criminal market, probably because the PCC has get into some places, into some states, so the violence has dropped a little bit. But again, I don't have the numbers. This is from the Atlas de Violencia. We don't have the numbers for 2020 or 2021 yet. But the most important part we wanted to share with you has to be with the international, at the first time, regional expansion of PCC. The first thing, as we have already heard, was to take Paraguay and make Paraguay have to deal with different kind of drug, not only cocaine in that case, but also marijuana, since it was where the war started between the PCC and the Comando Vermelho, but also because of its strategic place. And even though it seems weird, at least for a not trained eye, it is very important to control Paraguay because you are closer to the production, you are closer to Bolivia and Peru through Bolivia, cocaine coming through Bolivia and Peru, but you are also very close to the route of some of the route that may take the cocaine out of the region with no red flags being raised on the other side of the ocean. And this is a very important concept. And as Ryan mentioned it, and we have worked on it with Dr. Valesca Troncoso, we write an article of the use of non-traditional ports, and we talk about Buenos Aires and Montevideo and how these ports are being used because they are not rising any red flags on the other side of the ocean. And in that particular case, the use of the riverway, which comes from Paraguay, but start actually in Bolivia, is very, very important. On the other hand, we also have to bear in mind that the PCC has also a big presence in Bolivia. And I should make a difference between the presence in Paraguay and in Bolivia, where they kind of arrive into the prisons, start getting new members from that countries, and play an important role in the countries. This is absolutely different from the incursions, I may say, in Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, where there are a lot of different criminal actors. Many of them have a lot of experience. For example, if we talk about the FARC, it will be almost a suicide for PCC to try to get into Colombia. It is better in that way to try to cooperate with the FARC and try to get the cocaine as cheaper as they can in order to get it out of the region. As Dr. Ryan also mentioned, there are certain reports that talk about the presence of PCC recently in Uruguay and to the less regard in Argentina, but in the northern part, in the three-border area between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And there are intelligence reports regarding the presence of PCC in Europe, in Spain, in Portugal, particularly. In Africa, as Ryan mentioned, we remember the case of Fuminho in Mozambique, but also there are other cases that show the presence of PCC in a different way, again, not as in Paraguay, not as in Bolivia, but cooperating with other criminal organizations, with local criminal organizations in order to use the routes. Also in Central America, and according to this is federal police investigation, there has been some attempts, particularly to work with money laundering in the US. So this is something to bear in mind, because apparently PCC is much more bigger than we have thought, and it's no longer the rustic organization we thought it was. I would love to talk a lot about this, but I will just show you the portfolio of ports that criminal organization can use to get the cocaine out of South America, as I said. And if you pay attention, from Brazil, you have plenty of options to go to traditional markets and also these new markets. In the Middle East Africa is being used as transshipment point, but it's also a new consumption place. Here in this map, it's only about, the Gulf of Guinea and the Sahel, but there is some route that go to Southern Africa, I would say, and also from there to Oceania. So just to bear in mind that there is some other actors and the difficulties to control the borders, especially the borders with the sea from Brazil. Finally, and I will love to discuss whatever you want during the Q&A, we need to bear in mind that the PCC became a regional player in the first place. It started like a small player in Sao Paulo. After that, it went to the states around Sao Paulo. After that, the presence became national. And when they were national, they went into this internalization process we mentioned. They have expanded beyond South America right now, as we have seen before. This has to be with, in my opinion at least, with two main things. The first thing is the demand of cocaine in different markets, which is bigger and bigger every year, and the geopolitical emplacement of Brazil. It is central to understand the nature of the conflict, as Marcos have mentioned. Drug trafficking route has evolved and will evolve, will change the whole time, from South America to Africa, from Africa to the US or to Canada, from Africa to Europe, but also using ports, as I said, non-traditional ports, as Buenos Aires, Montevideo, San Antonio in Chile. And we also have to bear in mind that we have also thought that organized crime was like a zero-sum game. But we have seen recently that there are many alliances, many cooperation between criminal organizations, and particularly in the case of Europe, mafias that were along with our South American criminal organization, especially when it comes to cocaine and the distribution of this cocaine. So thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any doubt or if you want to discuss anything further, please let me know.
Thanks, Carolina. That was absolutely fascinating. I mean, that map you show was really, really, and with your explanation, of course, really gave us an idea of the spread of the PCC and the number of alliances, different type of alliances with different criminal groups across the world. I love to speak more about that, but I think we'll have the opportunity in the Q&A. I just want to also give the chance to Paula to actually discuss one of the very important, I think, topic, very topical, given the specific moment, quite important, quite delicate junction in which Brazil is at the moment. So general election happening in October in a context of political polarization, but also lots of many socio-economic and political challenges for the new president, the new administration. The general election have also the potential of changing some of the conflict dynamics, right? Both in terms of approach to its socio-economic root causes, but also in terms of security policies. So with that, Paula, it would be great to hear your voice, your views on the election outcomes, if possible, and also what would be, in your view, the outlook for conflict with the new administration.
Good morning, and once again, thank you for the invitation. I'm not. Can you hear me? Okay. So good morning, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to be living my previous life, where I was a researcher and practitioner on the field of prevention of crime, with my current life working with media. So I think that, as we've seen from the previous presentations, I think violence in Brazil is an issue that has crossed our entire history in different versions. In our democratic history, what we see as well is that it is a topic that has challenged governments with different political inclinations. So it's not only a matter of the context, but it's a matter also of how challenging the public policy around the topic is. Independently, of course, there are nuances, there are differences, but you can see a consistent historic of very high homicide rates. I think that Brazil also brings a good example to make the discussion around the topic of development and violence. Even when Brazil was at a point growing economy, perceived as a promising economy compared to other countries in the world, still we had extremely high levels of conflict. I'm bringing out this to tell you that I think that the problem in Brazil is, of course, structural. It's part of our history. It's part of how we've built ourselves as a society, but it has serious policy implications, because it challenges. Sometimes you're going to see violence in contributing to consolidate a certain political context. Sometimes you're going to see violence contributing to consolidate a certain economic activity. So I believe it's harder and harder to dissociate violence in Brazil from to make the differentiation between legal and illegal. What we see is that we have these two spheres very much combined in many situations. That's why I chose to address 4 specific points that, for me, they're linked with the structural aspects of violence in Brazil, but combined with our very specific current context. We are on the verge of an election, a presidential election in Brazil, but not any election. I think this election is a very important one, because the country is going. We had a pandemic that killed more 600,000 people in Brazil. We are going through a very severe economic crisis with high levels of unemployment. And I could say that our democracy is at stake. At least Brazil feels that is disputing its democracy, its democratic history in this election as well. So these are components that, from my perspective, are essential for us to understand the current scenario when it comes to violence. And the first element that I would like to bring is the topic of political violence, which is a very broad concept. It can be applied to several different contexts. And I want to bring the example here to illustrate this, the killing of Marielle Franco, which for me is a very emblematic episode of political violence. Marielle Franco was a city councilor that was in the city of Rio de Janeiro. She was a Black LGBT woman that was killed in 2018. Her killers were not, until today, her killers were not found. And this became a very emblematic crime. And why is that? And a very emblematic when it comes to the topic when we talk about political violence. Because first, we have been having in Brazil an amplification of representativeness within the political sphere. So you have more Black people, more LGBT people being elected officials in Brazil. But these people are as they are elected, they are more and more attacked when they are officials. So there is a debate now here in Brazil that you not only have to elect people, the so-called minorities, but you have to find ways and means to allow them to continue their mandates while they're elected. And all this because of political violence. So Marielle is very emblematic in this sense, but not only because she represented the minorities, but because her killing is associated with the militias. So it's a combination of these two things. And and this is also an element that is important for us to understand why her killers were not found until nowadays. So the militias in Rio, they are one of the best examples of how illegal forces have merged with state forces, are operating within illegal markets, but have diversified their work. They're not only working with drug traffic anymore, but with stolen goods, with stolen cars. I recommend the research of Gabriel Feltran. Gabriel has an amazing research about PCC and has done incredible work on stolen cars. So I recommend his work. But what is interesting when it comes to the militias as well is that also mixed with religion, they have been able to have elected officials representing the interests of the militia. So you have a combination here where you have an actor who is operating illicit markets, but also has an arm within official environments such the state and city councilors and so on. So I think it's very challenging. We can no longer apply the, are you talking about licit or illicit? Because we have a territory here where these two spaces are combined. The other point, the second element I would like to bring here, and is one that my colleagues have addressed as well, is violence associated with land ownership. And I think that also in this case, you have layers of elements that needed to be listed in order to interpret that. So you have, I think Brazil has had also all through its histories, a lot of violence associated with land ownership, dispute for land ownerships, violence that occurs in remote areas of the country. Brazil is a continental country, areas where justice, the state in the form of the police or justice, is not necessarily present or is associated with illegal interests. Recently, the world saw the assassination of Bruno and Don Phillips. That I also think, as the murder, the killing of Marielle, was a very emblematic episode, because you are talking about a journalist and an indigenous that were working the territory to guarantee indigenous rights, indigenous rights to property, and they were killed. But we cannot understand that as something that is only related to local. There is no coincidence that there was a very brilliant piece in the New York Times. I don't know if you guys have read it, about illegal airstrikes in the Amazon related to toxic mining and indigenous communities. So we're talking about something that might sound very local because it's a journalist and is indigenous working with a specific indigenous group. But of course, we're talking about a context that involves much broader elements, such illegal airstrikes. If you see the pictures, they're impressive. They are not amateur. They're a real enterprise. We're talking about something that is mobilizing big markets. So it's not a small initiative. So all these things need to be connected. And in the case of the Amazon as well, we need to consider that our current president and the federal efforts during all his mandate has been to make it more flexible, the demarcation of indigenous lands. Brazil has had in the recent years a very consistent legislation, a very consistent effort to demarcate indigenous lands. This has been not the case in the past 4 years. And of course, this kind of things has a subjective perspective, which is how much the discourse impact the practices. So we have a federal government that keeps saying that you don't need, that indigenous people, despite the constitution, they don't have a rights to their lands. So it changes the debate, the public debate around the issue, but it has practical consequences as well, because you undermine the efforts to guarantee security on the field. You reduce the amount of resources that you've sent to the region, and you authorize illegal activities such as mining, cutting wood from an area that previously should be protected. My third point is what Marcos have already addressed, is the flexibilization of access to firearms. Brazil has a specific legislation that has been little by little changed by the gun lobby. I think we have approved the Estatuto do Desarmamento long time ago, and this legislation has been as a strategy to change the legislation. Instead of having a big public fight, they have been promoting little change via congressmen that are supported by the gun lobby. So they started allowing specific professions, so lawyers can have access to firearms. I don't know, teachers. You start to create special concessions within the legislation that do more and more. But this president, Bolsonaro, has actively been very active in promoting change in the legislations to expand access of firearms. And there is where we see, again, a combination of licit and illicit. Not only you have citizens, then more citizens that now have access to firearms, and we are already seeing in Brazil episodes of increased violence related to guns because of this facilitated access. But not only that, but recently there was a piece affirming that a member of PCC used a collector's license to acquire guns. So again, you have illicit mechanisms because now legislation is amplifying access to different people. So you're amplifying who can be defined as a collector of guns. So you have a member of the PCC using this legal instrument to buy guns. So again, you have different levels here of a state that intentionally wants to amplify access to firearms. You have a society, at least part of it. Actually, as in the US, the majority of Brazilians, they don't want to have access to firearms. This is the gun lobby saying that we want, but we don't. The majority of Brazilians think this is not a good idea. But still have people who want, and they can buy guns, and usually not by coincidence, these are the most violent people, and they actually want to use their guns. But then you have an illicit actor that uses the legit mechanism to access a firearm. And my last point is political violence itself associated to this particular election. So we have a context in the country where it's not new. It started before the previous election cycle. The country, and it's not exclusive to Brazil, the country has become more and more polarized. I think that public debate is a concept that has changed in Brazil. It's very hard to have a collective conversation nowadays. And not only around politics, but around policy agendas, specific policy agendas, such as the police, firearms, abortion, the traditional issues that mobilize different political fields. But all that has consequences in shaping the interactions between individuals, but it has consequences in shaping how much space as a country we give to violence in this political process. So just to let you know, Lula alleged has increased his security detail. There's a lot of concerns. There was a lot of debate whether Lula would go to open events or not. And it's known that his security is a major issue. Bolsonaro arrived in the presidential debate this week, and his team has done a security scan in the entire building. Was something that was addressed very seriously. So it is a topic in this presidential election. There is fear, there is a worry about what kind of political violence we could have. But apart from that, I think we have a challenge also in labeling events as political violence. We recently had an homicide in Brazil of someone the guy was having a birthday party with the topic of the theme of his birthday party was Lula. And someone entered his birthday party and killed him because he was a Bolsonaro fan. So I'm making the story very simple, but the narrative is basically this one. And this was not classified. This was not understood as an episode of political violence. So it's also very hard. I think polarization and making violence something that is political makes it harder for us to apply the concept of political violence, because by calling something political violence, you're accused of being political. You're accused of trying to instrumentalize the concept of political violence, because it seems that you're choosing sides. It seems that you're trying to use this to diminish or to hurt one of the political sides. I think there are other challenges associated with that. One is that Brazil has a federal police, that it has had a lot of independence, and there is a debate if this is still the case. So who is going to conduct independently investigations that are associated with political violence? Who will be responsible for that? So I think this is like something that we need to face, because we already have in Brazil one of the lowest homicide resolution rates. Depending on the state, this is like almost information that you can almost not access at all. Our level of impunity is also very high, but the federal police was known to be an actor that was more efficient compared to state police when it comes to crime investigations. If it is no longer 100% independent institution, how are we going to deal with episodes of political violence? And finally, I think that is an element that we haven't addressed in this session, but it is inevitable. We're in a moment in Brazil where the army, the Brazilian army, has a protagonism that has never had during our democratic, during our democracy in Brazil. So it's absolutely is something that is very new for us. The army has always been there, but their protagonism at the moment is something very new to the conversation. So they've been part of the government. Bolsonaro comes from the military. We had ministers, many ministers that came from the military, but they have become an active political player. They are part of the conversation now. And this is something, it is a change that we need to note because it's an important political change. I think that many of these issues that we've been discussing here so far, they have to do also with national sovereignty. So when it comes to Amazon, the army, it is a very important player. They have a lot of interest in the region, and we're talking about borders, so they have been always a player. But now we're talking about the army as a political player, mixed also with national politics. So ending here, I think that we still have times for a little bit of discussion, but I would say that it is a very critical scenario. I think that the levels of violence, the consequence of the high levels of violence in Brazil, I think one of the main consequences is that the Brazilian society still demands for more punishment. And it's not that we haven't had it. The incarceration rates in Brazil are incredibly high. What we have had is proof of inefficiency. So we have proof that high incarceration rates doesn't work, because we have some of the highest in the world. The state where I live, São Paulo, has changed, like it has escalated in a way that I've never seen anywhere else. I mean, we could call it mass incarceration. We have a police that it's extremely uses violence a lot. We have a very high rate of policemen that are killed. So we have a lot of elements to actually understand that this kind of repression doesn't work. And it has been almost the sole response from governments and the sole demand from Brazilian society, because we are also a society that lives in fear. So we cannot not know that. I think that a society that lives in fear is a society that has a big difficulty, and with structural inequalities, has a big difficulty in imagining other policy responses that are not the ones based mostly on repression. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Paula. You actually, I mean, you didn't tell us actually what's going to happen in the election, but I think those trends you have highlighted are going to stay there as huge challenges for the next president anyway. I think political violence, which you mentioned, this kind of mix between legal and illegal activities, and also what you mentioned in terms of police, army, those are actually new elements which are going to complicate even further the outlook for conflict and pacification in the country. You also have addressed, we had one question from our audience on incarceration and prison, obviously, as this is something that it's very much part of the organized crime scene in Brazil. I think Brazil is probably one of the only countries where the gangs, the organized crime groups are actually based in prisons. The leadership is based in prison. So I think it's interesting what I guess you answer the question, and even there, we need more a different solution. The other question, I'm just in the interest of time, because we're almost done with our time. We can of course stay another 5 minutes, but we have another question which we haven't really discussed, which is what from Rodrigo, asking really what's the organized crime kind of infiltration in politics in Brazil. This is something we have seen in many other countries in the region. I guess, Paula, you mentioned a little bit those kind of topics, but does anyone have a view or wants to discuss that question, especially with reference to militias? We haven't really talked about militias, but those are actually very well connected organizations, right? So with politics and obviously, public security. So does anyone want to answer to this question from Rodrigo? Maybe Marcos, I guess.
Yes, I can make short comments about this, no? And this question from Rodrigo, I think the infiltration that's clear, maybe the one that most commented, is the militia groups, especially in Rio de Janeiro, but not only, no? Historically, we see this connection between some corrupt police and politicians. And for example, in the Northeast Brazil, we have a classic work, for example, from Shepherd Hughes that shows, for example, how this historical is not from today, no? And also, it's important to think the infiltration in some judicial branch, no? In some extent, we see this, especially when we talk about the criminal organizations connected with drug trafficking, as we see cases in Mato Grosso do Sul state, for example, with PCC and even Sampó.
Thanks, Marcos. I had a question for Carolina, because we didn't really, sorry, Carolina, do you want also to add on that? So go ahead, and then or maybe I'll ask you my question as well, so you can address both of them. I just wonder whether you could expand a little bit. Also, you mentioned that the PCC may have a kind of a relationship of cooperation with FARC in Colombia. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit, not just on FARC, but for instance, is there any known links with Mexican cartels, for instance, along the same type of cooperation, or even with the European mafia, which you have put in your presentation? So just on those topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. I just wanted to add something to what Marcos just commented on the idea of this relation between political power and criminal power. And he also mentioned this hybrid governance during his dissertation. And I think it's very important to understand that when criminal organization has the power in the terrain, they have the power and they are legitimate in front of society. They are bridges between political elites and communities and civil society. So the power that they may have may become a way to exchange favor with political powers, particularly at very low levels, like municipal levels, maybe statewide levels, but not more than that. But as Marcos mentioned, also we have to think in the bigger picture, but I wanted to add this little thing that I think it's important because we may not notice in the everyday life, but it's happening and it's penetrating political life and also civilian life. Regarding your question about the relationship between Mexicans and BCC, I don't know. I really don't think so. I think they work like in different markets. Probably the Mexicans are more related to the Colombian side, but considering the role of mafias, yes, there is a relationship. There is a proof relationship with Ndrangheta, for example. We know they are partners in this cocaine distribution. We used to think that the Ndrangheta took the cocaine from Santos, for example, and took it from there to Africa or Europe. Right now, this probably has changed, and the BCC is doing some of this logistic and getting closer to Europe and Africa too, particularly because there has been some clue elements that shows the presence of the organization in those terrains. So they work together, and we have seen this cooperation also with mafias in Africa, with Nigerian mafias. So it's like a partnership. As I said before, it's no longer a Zoom Zero game. So it's very interesting, and there is a lot of research to be done. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that that needs to be one of our next events. I think the transnationalization of organized crime across the region and beyond the region is definitely very interesting and worth observing and doing more research on. So we are almost at the end. Actually, we're past the end. But I just had a last question for Paula. Very quickly, obviously the polls shows that probably Lula will win. Obviously, hoping that is going to be a peaceful election with all the risks you have highlighted. But what do you think, very quickly, if that happens, what would it actually herald some change in terms of the security policies you have mentioned as well, in terms of obviously firearms and also police brutality, which is something that Marcos has also mentioned.
So I haven't addressed this last question because I think the results of the election, depending on the results of the elections, we would have such different scenarios. But if you ask me to analyze what would be a scenario if Lula is elected, I think Lula has been in his governments and also during Dilma's mandates. Firearm legislation has been something that has been very respected. I don't think that they have a different understanding than the original legislation that we had. I mean, there's no distance there. I think they understand the need for us to have gun control and the consequences of not having. So in this regard, I think, but however, it doesn't matter that it is decided on Congress. So it depends very much. This election is also an election that will change our Congress. So it depends very much on the profile of the Congress. Gun lobby has been very effective in electing very vocal congressmen. A few years ago, there was a study showing, and it's very much similar to the US and maybe other countries. It's just that I know only about the US, but there has been a study showing the amount of donations done by gun lobby to specific congressmen, and these people have been very vocal. So I think there is one level that is what the federal government thinks of the topic. The other thing is how the issue will be discussed and legislated in the Congress. When it comes to the police, I think that Lula has been, it's a delicate issue for his campaign because he doesn't want to seem very soft. Any candidate, that's a very delicate political issue during any campaign, because in a society, in a context as the Brazilian one, and of course, because we're in such an economic crisis, also, we have different rates of different crimes, such as robbery. They have increased a lot. So Brazil is going back to a place of fear that I haven't seen in 10 years. So you're having people being robbed in cars, being attacked. So because you also, at the same time, Brazil has been back to the map of hunger. So it's a very dramatic context, the one we're living right now. So it is a delicate issue for a left-wing campaign because they don't want to seem very soft on the topic, because no one wants a soft, at least from a general perspective, a society doesn't want a soft response to a severe criminal context. On the other hand, we've seen, for instance, states like Bahia, that has been a state governed by a governor from the Workers' Party, where you have very high levels of police brutality. So Bahia is a state that is very also, it's an Achilles heel to the left, because it is a state where you have a high concentration of Black people in Brazil. It is a poor state, and it is a state where you have extremely high levels of police brutality. The reason I'm bringing this example, because I don't think there is a simple equation. I think that in Lula's first to second mandate, there was a huge effort to create the national system of national security, to go back to that model. There was an effort to think about a national strategy on security. I think that we've lost that, and we are at a different point that we were because of the economic reality. So this, I'm certain that this would be, together with hunger, together with inflation, this would be one of the biggest challenges to the next government, and will be also a key element to define its relationship with the state governments, because that's another element. The police mandates are at the state level. So how much this also will set the tone, is an element that will help set the tone of the relationship between state governments and the federal government.
Thanks, Paula. It was, I mean, with this very, very detailed answer, and I think there are so many different challenges, and you have explained them so well for the next government. Unfortunately, we are already 10 minutes past our normal closing time. Ryan had to leave, so just have to convey his excuses. But thanks so much to all of you, to Marco Salan, to Carolina, to Paula, to Ryan, of course, he left, and to Juan. We're looking forward to follow up the conversation with other webinars and other events, hopefully in London as well. We are going to post this webinar on our website and on YouTube. So for people who have missed it, will be there available. And I think it's something that it's of extreme value for experts on conflict in Latin America and in Brazil in particular. Last message from us, the self-promotion message, the new armed conflict survey report will be published on the 18th of November. So we're looking forward maybe to have another event after that. Thanks so much again, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.